His hands move before the light does. Long before the sun touches the horizon, Justin Jones sits at his kitchen table with a single lamp throwing yellow light across the wood, and he sorts through his seeds the way other men might say grace. It is a slow and deliberate process because for him, the work itself is the entire point. He has spent 30 years doing exactly this. He never signed a single contract. He never bought a bag from a seed representative, and he never felt the need to explain why to his neighbors or the bank. Even when the men with clipboards and clean boots kept showing up in his driveway to ask him to reconsider his life, he just kept working. His neighbors eventually decided he had lost his mind. While they watched from across the fence, his land was quietly becoming something that none of them had a name for yet. What does a man learn about his own soil in 30 years that a legal contract can never account for? That is the question at the heart of this story. By the late 1980s, the hybrid seed revolution was no longer a prediction for the future because it had already arrived in full force. You could see the change in the yields, and you could hear it at the local co-op, where men who had farmed the same ground for generations started talking about input packages and performance data. They used to talk about the weather, but now the numbers were the only thing that seemed real. The pressure to follow along was not the kind that came with threats, but it was the quieter kind of pressure that lives in the shadow of a neighbor's success. Ray Cutler was the first one in the area to sign. He farmed the quarter section directly east of Justin's place, and the very first year he switched to the hybrid package, his corn came in taller and thicker than anything Justin had ever seen him grow. Ray did not say a word about the results to anyone, but he did not have to, because the field said everything for him. The representative from AgriGlobal eventually showed up in a white pickup truck that had never touched a dirt road before it turned into Justin's driveway. His name was Miller, and he was the kind of man who stayed organized with a clipboard and a laminated brochure that broke down the figures by county average to make the math feel personal. He stood at the kitchen door and walked through the entire pitch without rushing a single word. He talked about yield improvements and technical guidance, and he mentioned that the contract was only 3 pages long, with language that was easy to understand. Justin read every single page while the man waited. He set the papers down on the table, handed them back to Miller, and told him no thank you, before heading back out to the barn. There was no argument and no long explanation. There was only the sound of the screen door closing, followed by the noise of the clipper fanning mill starting up in the dust.
If you have never heard a fanning mill run, it has a very specific rhythm that sounds like a slow, mechanical breath. Air moves through the machine in a steady current to separate what is worth keeping from what needs to be thrown away. The chaff and the light debris go one way, while the clean seed drops through the screens and out the other side. The whole machine vibrates just enough to send a fine dust rising into the afternoon light, and the sound it makes fills a barn in a way that is neither loud nor quiet. Justin had run that machine so many times that he did not even need to watch it anymore, so he just listened to the rhythm. Down in his cellar, the labeled burlap sacks were starting to stack up against the walls. Each one was marked in his own handwriting with the variety and the year and the condition of the crop at harvest. The work was unglamorous and invisible to everyone else, and nobody ever thinks to photograph a man sorting seed in a dark cellar. Nobody writes stories about the patience it takes to track germination rates by hand, or the physical toll of carrying 40-pound bags down stone steps in the November cold. The first real cost of his decision arrived sooner than he expected. During the season after Ray's big harvest, the yield gap between Justin's ground and the contracted farms was brought up at a co-op meeting. It was not said meanly, but it was stated as a simple fact that Justin was being stubborn, and someone in the back of the room laughed. Justin sat in his folding chair and did not offer an answer. On the drive home that night, he passed by Ray's field while it was being prepped for another hybrid season. The rows were perfectly uniform,
and the soil had been turned to a consistent depth by a tractor making a GPS-guided pass. It looked efficient because it was efficient, and Justin actually pulled his truck over to look at it for a long moment. Then he drove the rest of the way home and ran his fanning mill until the light was completely gone. The gap between his yields and his neighbor's yields kept growing through those early years, and Miller kept coming back to the house. Each visit felt a little more formal than the last one, and the paperwork got a little thicker every time. The conversations got shorter and shorter, until Justin would simply hand the papers back and return to his work in the barn. He did not explain himself to anyone back then. The explanation was already being written, one season at a time, in a cellar where nobody else thought to look. The notebook started as a practical record, something to consult when a variety underperformed, and Justin needed to know if the fault lay with the seed or the season. He had picked it up at the hardware store in town, a simple, wide-ruled book with a brown cover, and he started writing in it the same year Miller made his first visit. By the early 1990s, that little book had become something much harder to name. Every entry followed the same strict format of variety, row location, and planting date, followed by the emergence rate and how the plants responded to the weather. There was no flourish or extra detail in his short sentences, but over time the entries accumulated a texture that the format alone could not explain. A note from 1991 recorded a late frost on April 14th that killed the first stand in rows 3 through 7, which he then replanted from the 1989 stock. Those plants came back slower than the others, but they held their ground through July. Another note from 1993 described a drought year where August ran completely dry, and he noted that the red held its own while everything else went thin. He told himself to save every kernel from those specific rows. The bags in the cellar carried that same language, which was not the language of marketing or agronomy, but a plain record of what the land had been asked to endure and what had actually come through the other side. Justin was not a man who talked about his work in terms that other people found useful or easy to understand. When someone at the feed store asked why he kept saving seed when the hybrid packages were clearly outperforming him in a wet year, he would just say that the wet years are not the ones that matter. It sounded like stubbornness to his neighbors, like a man who had decided he was right and simply stopped listening to anyone else. But the log told a different story that was neither comfortable nor triumphant, serving instead as a long and specific record of 2 decades of observation. This history could not be compressed into a conversation at the feed store because it did not live in the kind of language people use in those places. The explanation for why Justin did what he did was sitting in a cellar in a brown notebook that nobody had ever asked to see, and because of that, he never offered it. What the notebook was actually tracking was adaptation, though nobody used that word to describe it at the time. The Jones red corn he had been selecting from was no longer the same plant his grandfather had grown, and it was changing in a direction that the yield data at the co-op meetings could not capture. The roots were going deeper into the earth, and the stalks were thickening at the base in a way that only became obvious during the dry years. In a wet year, his yields looked modest to the point of being unimpressive, but in a dry year, they looked like something else entirely. The hybrid seed next door was optimized for the average conditions its breeders anticipated when they designed it in a lab. Optimization is efficient and profitable, right up until the weather falls outside the narrow range the seed was built to handle. Justin was not optimizing his crop. He was in a long conversation with it. The land would present a difficult season, the seed would respond, and Justin would watch which plants survived so he could save from those specific years. Then he would write it down and do it all again the following year. The notebook was the record of that 30-year call and response between one man, one piece of ground, and one variety of corn that was slowly becoming specific to both. He did not explain himself to the neighbors because the explanation was 30 years long. and it lived in a cellar. By the mid-1990s, the seed industry had stopped being a marketplace and turned into something closer to a landlord arrangement. The independent seed houses that had operated in the county for decades were being absorbed, one by one, into larger companies that had no interest in handshakes. These were businesses with family names on the signage, but the new owners preferred long contracts that drifted further from plain English with every renewal cycle. Farmers were suddenly dealing with repurchase requirements, stewardship agreements, and audit clauses that changed the nature of their work. Ray Cutler mentioned once that he had to sign a paper giving the company the right to inspect his fields for unauthorized seed use, and he said it matter-of-factly, the way you accept a toll on a road you have to travel. Miller came back in the spring of 2001, but he was not the same man who had stood at the kitchen door with a laminated brochure years earlier. He had been promoted to regional manager, which meant he had a larger territory and a much more complicated set of responsibilities. The easy accounts had all signed their contracts years ago, leaving only the holdouts, and Justin was the longest-running holdout in the entire district. There was no brochure during this visit, and instead, Miller sat at the kitchen table and opened a formal folder. He used words like contamination liability and varietal drift to explain that heritage varieties grown near patented hybrid stock created a legal exposure for everyone in the area. Cross-pollination did not require intent on the part of the farmer, and Miller made it clear that the courts had already settled that issue. He mentioned a case out of Canada where a farmer had lost that exact argument, and even though the man had been growing canola instead of corn, Miller insisted the principle still applied. He was not being openly threatening, but he was informing Justin of the risks, which was a much more unsettling version of the conversation. Justin let him finish his explanation while the folder sat open on the table between them. Outside, the fanning mill was silent because it was too early in the season, and the kitchen was quiet enough that the sound of the refrigerator cycling felt loud. Justin stood up and told Miller he appreciated him driving all the way out to the farm. Miller looked at him for a moment before closing his folder, asking if Justin understood what he was describing. Justin said that he did, and then he held the door open for the man to leave. That was the extent of the conversation, and after Miller drove back down the gravel road, Justin went to the cellar and stood among the bags for a long time. The social arithmetic of the neighborhood had been shifting for years, but after that visit, it settled into something fixed and cold. Justin was no longer just an eccentric neighbor. He was a potential liability to the people around him. A few of the neighbors had heard through the local grapevine that AgriGlobal had paid him a formal visit, and the subtext was not subtle. If his seed drifted onto their ground, they could be drawn into a legal mess they wanted no part of. And while nobody said this to his face, the distance at the co-op was easy to measure. The bad season finally arrived 2 years later in the form of a dry summer that hit Justin harder than the contracted farms. The hybrid packages came with drought response chemicals built into the input bundle, and because Justin was working without that safety net, he lost real money that year. The bank called him with the particular kind of patience that communicates deep discomfort without ever stating it directly. He went down to the cellar that October and stood with a lantern among 30 labeled bags. He considered, seriously and without any drama, whether 30 years of following a different logic had simply produced 30 years of a slower failure. He wondered if the notebook, the fanning mill, and the long conversations he had been having with his ground were just an elaborate way of being wrong. The bag from 1993 was sitting right there, marked as a drought year survivor in his own handwriting from the time the driest August on record hit the county. He remembered how certain rows had kept going when everything around them gave out, and that memory made him turn off the lantern and go back upstairs. He kept going not because he was certain of the outcome, but because the seed was changing, and he needed to see where it was going. The cellar stays cold on its own. It has stone walls and a stone floor, holding on to the kind of temperature a hill keeps without being asked. Justin hadn't bothered to install any refrigeration down there because he simply didn't need to. The ground does the work for you if you build where the ground wants you to build, which is something his grandfather understood and the people who design climate-controlled seed storage facilities tend to forget. When the temperature stays below 50 degrees, seed metabolism slows down to nearly nothing. The biological clock doesn't stop, but it runs at a fraction of its normal speed, which means the seed stays viable longer than most people would expect. Justin tested his germination rates every spring before planting by using a simple paper towel test where he would count how many out of 10 seeds sprouted in a week. His 30-year-old stock was coming in at 80 to 90% viability, and that number matters because a commercial operation considers anything above 85% acceptable for planting. Justin was hitting that mark on seed that had been selected, cleaned, bagged, and stored by one man on one farm without a single piece of cooling equipment.
The burlap was the other part of the equation. Breathable fabric lets the seed respire slightly, which prevents the moisture buildup that glass or plastic traps and turns into mold. The bag sat elevated off the stone floor on wooden pallets to keep them away from the slow damp that stone draws upward from the earth in wet seasons. None of this was complicated, but all of it required consistent attention, and consistent attention is the thing that looks like stubbornness from the outside. But what was happening to the seed down there went beyond simple storage. The Jones Red had been selected generation by generation from the rows that performed under specific pressures on this specific piece of ground. This wasn't a lab or a controlled environment designed to isolate variables. It was just one Kansas field with its particular soil composition, its drainage patterns, its history of wet springs and dry Augusts, and the occasional late frost that catches everything unprepared. The seed that went back into the ground each year carried the genetic memory of having survived those things, and the seed that came out each year was slightly more capable of surviving them again. You don't see this happening, and that's the part that makes it hard to defend at a co-op meeting. The roots were going deeper, which Justin had proven by quietly digging them up and comparing them to the hybrid roots in Ray's rows next door. The stalks were thickening at the crown in a way that showed up under moisture stress, and the timing of pollination had shifted by a few days over 2 decades. It moved slightly later in the summer to avoid the heat window that killed pollen viability in a bad July. None of these changes had been engineered by a scientist, but they'd been selected by the land through the seed, with Justin acting as the patient intermediary who kept showing up and writing things down. Genetic diversity is invisible until it isn't, and that's the thing about it. When conditions stay inside the range a crop was bred for, diversity looks like inefficiency. You see the neighbor's uniform rows yielding better per acre, and the math seems to settle the argument right then and there. The argument only reopens when conditions go outside that range, and they always do eventually, because that's what conditions do. One afternoon in late summer, Justin sat at the edge of the south field eating a sandwich and watching Ray's tractor make another perfect pass through perfectly uniform rows. The GPS kept the line's rulers straight, and the tractor barely needed steering at all. It was efficient in a way that was almost beautiful, if efficiency can be beautiful. Justin watched it for a while, finished his sandwich, and folded the wax paper. Then the summer came that nobody in the county would forget. It came from the south, the way bad things usually do in a Kansas summer. It didn't arrive dramatically, and there was no single morning where you could walk out and see disaster. It arrived the way fungal pressure always does, which is gradually and then all at once. You might see a few yellowing leaves on a lower stalk, or a slight softening at the crown, the kind of thing a farmer notices and tries not to name before he's sure. By the second week of July, he was sure. The pathogen moved through the county's contracted fields the way fire moves through a room where every surface is the same material. That's the biological logic of what happened. And it isn't a metaphor, it's just mechanics. When every farm in a 40-mile radius plants from the same seed source and the same parent lines, what you've built is not a farming region. You've built a single organism expressed across thousands of acres, and a single organism has a single point of failure. The blight didn't need to find a weakness because the weakness was already there, written into every row, uniform and waiting. Ray's field went first, or at least that's when Justin first saw it from the road.
The stalks were still standing, which made it look almost normal from a distance, but the leaves had started to die from the bottom up. It was a yellowing that moved fast, and when you got close enough, you could see the long, tan, water-soaked lesions that don't stop once they start. Within 10 days, the upper leaves were going, and within 2 weeks, the field looked like it had aged a decade in a single season. Ray walked his rows every morning that week, and you could see even from the road what the walking was costing him. The co-op phone lines ran hot, and the county extension office was flooded with calls. Yield projections that had looked solid in June were being revised downward, then revised again as the math kept getting worse. The situation kept getting worse because the genetic uniformity that made the hybrid system so efficient in a good year made it catastrophically fragile in this one. There was no resistant pocket and no row that held while its neighbor failed. It was the same seed stock with the same vulnerability, leading to the same result, field by field and farm by farm, down the road in both directions. Justin's field took damage, and it would be dishonest to say otherwise. But the story doesn't need dishonesty to make its point. The blight crossed his fence line, and some rows showed the same lesioning and the same upward progression of death. This wasn't a miracle, and the pathogen didn't stop at his property line out of respect for 30 years of patient work. But it couldn't find a clean path through his crop. That's the difference, and it's not a small one. The Jones Red wasn't a single genetic line, it was a population. 30 years of selection from a single piece of ground had produced a variety with enough internal variation that the blight hit different plants differently. Some rows went down fast, while some slowed the progression, and a few in the northwest corner barely showed symptoms at all. Those were the ones planted from the seed Justin had been selecting for drought tolerance since the mid-1990s. Nobody engineered that, and nobody had anticipated this specific pathogen in this specific summer. The variation wasn't designed for this moment, but it was just broad enough that this moment couldn't consume it entirely. The field looked wrong because it was uneven and patchy, having none of the clean geometry of a good harvest season. Some plants were standing and some were down, with the damage distributed in a pattern that followed no obvious logic unless you knew the seed history of each individual row. Only one person knew that history. From the road, it looked like a partial failure, which it was. But from the road, Ray's field looked like a complete one. Justin walked his rows that evening without the notebook, which was unusual for him. He already knew what he needed to know, and the question now was whether anyone else would come to understand it, and how long that would take. Word travels fast in a county where everyone knows what everyone else planted. They didn't show up as a group, and that is the first thing you need to understand about how this happened. There was no formal delegation or organized visit, and nobody bothered to call ahead to see if he was home. They came the way people always come when they are too proud to admit why they are there, arriving separately at odd hours and slowing down on the road before pulling into the driveway like they had made the decision at the very last second. Ray Cutler was the third person to pull in, which caught Justin off guard because he expected Ray to be the last one to show up, if he showed up at all. Ray had spent years invested in a different version of the truth, where the hybrid package was the only logical choice, and Justin's refusal to change was just a 20-year mistake that left money on the table. But Ray pulled his truck up on a Tuesday morning, stepped out into the dust, and walked to the fence line where he stood staring at the field in total silence for a long time. Justin walked out from the house and took his place on the other side of the wire. "Some of it held," Ray said, though it sounded more like a statement than a question. "Some of it," Justin replied. Ray nodded toward the northwest corner, which was the section that had come through the storm looking the cleanest, and these were the rows Justin had been selecting from since the mid-90s. "What is different about those ones?" 20 years of dry Augusts, Justin said. Ray looked at him for a moment before turning his eyes back to the stalks, and Justin let the quiet sit between them without trying to fill the space with words. What Ray was looking at was not a perfect field, and that is a point you have to hold on to, because it is easy to make a story like this feel like a clean victory. It was not clean at all, since there was real damage on the south end, and plenty of rows that had gone down just as fast as anything else in the county. But Ray's own field was visible from where they stood, and that field was finished, meaning the math on his season was already over. The banker arrived on a Thursday afternoon. He was the same man who had made that difficult loan call during the bad season 10 years ago, and he drove his personal truck instead of a company vehicle, which told Justin everything he needed to know about why the man was there. He stood at the fence for about 5 minutes before saying he owed Justin an apology, which was more than Justin ever expected to hear, so Justin told him there was no need for that, and he mostly meant it. Miller was the last one to visit. He didn't bring a folder or any legal documents or laminated sales materials this time, and he parked on the shoulder of the road instead of using the driveway, which felt like its own kind of statement. He walked the fence line slowly from the south to the north and stopped at that northwest corner for a long time while Justin watched him from the shade of the porch. Eventually, Miller turned around and looked at Justin across the distance of the yard. "This is not something we can buy," Miller said. "No," Justin said.
Or replicate.
"Not in a lab," Justin told him, "and not in 30 years, and maybe not even in 60. Miller stood there for another minute, and it is important to say that he was not a villain in any of this. He was just a man working for a system that made a certain kind of sense until the day it didn't. And now he was standing at a fence, looking at the proof that the logic had finally failed. Whatever he was feeling stayed hidden behind his eyes, and he gave Justin a short nod before walking back to his truck and driving away. A few of the other neighbors started asking about seed later that week, and they asked quietly without the usual energy of the co-op or the performance that public conversations usually require. Justin opened the cellar door for them and showed them the bags and the log. He never said he told them so. The land had already said everything that needed to be said, and the land does not care about having the last word. When evening came, he went back inside the house. The kitchen looked exactly the same as it always did, with the lamp on the table and the grain of the wood worn smooth where his arms had rested through 30 harvests. The window above the sink showed the dark shape of the trees against the sky, and the refrigerator cycled on and off the way it does when a house is finally quiet. He placed the log on the table and turned to the next blank page. The notebook he was using was not the first one he had owned. The original brown-covered book from the hardware store was full by 1999, and the second one was finished by 2008. So this was now the 4th volume in a set that shared the same wide-ruled format and plain cover. His handwriting looked much like it did in the very first entry, though it was a little slower now, and the letters were not quite as wide as they used to be. He wrote down the date and the variety and the specific row locations. He made a note of which sections had held firm and which ones had failed, and he recorded the sequence of the collapse compared to what he had seen during the dry year of 1993. He wrote it all down plainly without any extra emphasis because he believed you should record the weather rather than perform it. He wrote 2 sentences about the northwest corner and a note about selecting seed from those rows for the next planting, then added a line about the germination test from March. Near the bottom of the page, he wrote, "Neighbors came to the fence this week. Several asked about seed. Showed them the cellar. We'll share from the northwest stock in the spring." That was the end of it. He didn't add any commentary on what the season meant, or what 30 years of saying no had finally produced for him. The log was never a place for that kind of writing, since it was a record of what the land did and what survived, and he had kept that discipline for so long that it was now just a part of who he was. He closed the notebook. The seed for next year was already sorted and labeled on the shelf by the cellar stairs. He had finished that work 3 days ago before the neighbors started showing up and before Ray stood at the fence asking what made the northwest corner different. The sorting wasn't done because he was waiting for something to happen, but because that is simply what October means on this farm. Justin had not changed, and his neighbors finally understood that as they stood at a fence line in a county where the fields told a story that no contract could ever write. The people in this county had spent 30 years using one word to describe what he was doing:
They were just going to need a little more time to find the new one. The lamp stayed on for a while. Outside, the field sat in the dark the way it always does after a hard season, looking neither finished nor broken, but just resting the way ground rests when it has done something difficult and is already quietly getting ready to do it all over again. There is a specific kind of knowledge that only moves in one direction, and you cannot rush it or find it in a manual written by a company that optimizes for everything except your specific dirt. This wisdom moves at the speed of the seasons, which is a pace far slower than most people are willing to tolerate in the modern world. Justin understood these cycles the way a man understands something he has never had to put into words, mostly because he learned the rhythm of the land before he even had the language to describe it. His father had kept seed before him, and his grandfather had done the same, though neither of them were quite as systematic about the process as Justin eventually became.
He took a tradition that had always been there and gave it a notebook, a germination test, and a labeling system designed to survive him, which represents a much longer view of time than the typical farmer who only plans for the next yield. The fanning mill in that cellar mattered much more than it appeared to, because running heritage seed through that machine every season was about more than just keeping things clean. Every time he turned it on, the cleaning process acted as a selection event, where seeds that were too light or too small simply didn't make the cut. Only the densest and most viable kernels ever reached the burlap bags. And over 30 years, this invisible culling worked alongside the natural selection of the field to create something incredibly robust. The machine and the dirt were essentially solving the same problem from opposite ends of the barn. What this created over 3 decades was not a heritage variety in the way a museum might preserve an artifact, because the Jones Red wasn't just being saved. It was being developed, slowly, without the sterile conditions of a laboratory. And while his grandfather would have still recognized the plant, it had changed into something new. The original source was still there, much like a river carries its headwaters even after traveling 100 miles. But the seed that came out of the cellar each spring had become specific to this one farm. It had spent 30 years absorbing the local weather patterns and the soil chemistry of these fields, learning to handle the drainage quirks where the clay runs shallow on the north end. That is the real secret of what the cellar contained. It wasn't just a collection of seeds, but a living record of accommodation that showed a plant learning, generation by generation, exactly what this specific ground asked of it. Some investments pay you back in the same year you make them, but this was never one of those deals. The land does not reward your patience because it has some moral value for the trait, but rather because a real relationship takes time to build, and 30 years is barely enough to get the conversation started. The question you should sit with today isn't whether Justin was right to do what he did, but rather what you are tending in your own life and what you are only renting. If that question stayed with you, hit the subscribe button because there are more people out there like Justin, and their stories don't get told nearly often enough. What people didn't fully reckon with during those first few weeks of the blight was how fast the mood in the county changed. It wasn't a dramatic shift, and you didn't see any public breakdowns or heated confrontations at the co-op. The change was much quieter than that, and in some ways, it was a lot harder to watch. Men who had been farming with total confidence for 20 years started driving their own roads twice a day, checking their fields the way you check something you already know is wrong but need to verify anyway. The extension office ran out of every printed guide they had on fungal management. The chemical suppliers were backlogged on orders for input packages that were supposed to prevent exactly this, but the packages weren't working the way the sales data said they would. The reason for that failure was mechanical rather than some big conspiracy. The input package was designed around the same genetic assumptions as the seed it was sold with, so it treated for the specific vulnerabilities the hybrid's parent lines were known to carry. It hadn't been built for a pathogen race that had evolved to exploit the cytoplasmic uniformity present in almost all the seed stock in the region. The package was optimized for a threat that looked like previous threats, But this one was different. Justin watched all of this from the edge of his own situation, which was bad, but at least it was bounded. The damage on his south end had stabilized by late July, which was unusual because fungal progression in a warm, humid summer normally doesn't just stop on its own. What slowed the spread on his ground was the variety within the population. Not every plant carried the same susceptibility because not every plant was genetically identical. The blight had to find a new path around the resistant individuals. And finding a new path takes time that a pathogen doesn't always have before the weather shifts. This is what genetic diversity actually looks like when it's put into practice. It isn't a philosophical position about seed sovereignty or agricultural heritage, it's just biology. Populations with internal variation don't collapse all at once, because the thing doing the collapsing can't find a single key that opens every door. Justin hadn't planned for this to be a lesson. He had been doing something simpler and much harder, which was staying in a relationship with his ground long enough that the ground finally gave him something back. By the end of July, his northwest corner was still producing. It wasn't perfect, and the yields weren't what a good year would have brought, but the corn was there. Ray Cutler didn't have much to say on that Tuesday morning, but what he did before he left mattered more than words. He asked if he could walk the rows, and when Justin said yes, Ray spent 40 minutes moving through the field in total silence. Every so often he would stop to crouch down the way farmers crouch when something demands their full attention, looking at the base of the stalks and the root crowns. He studied the lesion patterns on the leaves that had been hit versus the ones that hadn't. He wasn't looking for a lecture. He was trying to understand something his yield data had never prepared him to see. When he finally came back to the fence, he had one more question. He asked how Justin decided which plants were worth saving for the following year. Justin thought about it for a second before he answered. "I keep the ones that did what I needed them to do in the conditions I actually had," he said. "Not the ones that looked the best during a good year." Ray stood with that thought for a long moment. Then he admitted he'd been doing the exact opposite, and he said it without any self-pity, just as a plain observation. The seed companies selected for peak performance in controlled conditions. So the seed he'd been buying every year was the product of a system that optimized for the best-case scenario. That works fine until you have a year that isn't good. What that conversation with Ray exposed was something the blight itself couldn't quite name. The contracted farms hadn't just been growing corn. They'd been renting a set of assumptions about what the future would look like. Assumptions are cheap to rent when the weather cooperates. The real price only becomes visible when the conditions stop cooperating. And by then, the contract for next season has usually already been signed. Miller's visit was the last one, and it settled something Justin had spent 30 years declining to put into words. When Miller stood at the north fence and said, "This isn't something we can buy," he wasn't admitting defeat. He was recognizing a category of thing that his industry had treated as obsolete for decades. He was looking at living knowledge that was site-specific and non-transferable. It's the kind of knowledge that only exists in the relationship between a person and a place, and you can't extract it or scale it up without it ceasing to be what it is. AgriGlobal could buy the seed, but they couldn't buy the 30 years of selection pressure that made the seed what it was. They couldn't buy the log, not because Justin wouldn't sell it, but because the log was only readable to someone who had also stood in those specific rows during those specific seasons. It was written in a language that required the land itself to translate. The neighbors who asked about seed that week ended up getting a lot more than just a bag of grain. They spent the afternoon in the cellar with the log open on the wooden shelf, while Justin walked them through his labeling system. He showed them which bag came from which rows and what conditions had selected those specific plants. He told them what to watch for in the first 2 seasons of replanting, while the variety was busy learning their ground instead of his. He warned them it would look worse before it looked better, because heritage varieties adapted to his land would need time to figure out theirs. He told them they needed to start keeping their own notes.
He said all of this the way you say something you've known for 30 years, but waited for the right moment to share. He spoke quietly and without any theater. By the time you've known a truth for that long, it stops feeling like wisdom and starts feeling like just the way things are. The lamp in the cellar swung slightly whenever the door opened and closed. The bags sat in their rows on the wooden pallets, each one labeled in the same handwriting that had been marking them since before some of these neighbors' kids were even born. The log sat on the shelf, and the fanning mill upstairs in the barn was silent for the season. Outside, the county's fields were doing what fields always do after a hard summer. They were settling into themselves as the stalks dried down and the damage became permanent. One season's loss always becomes permanent, while the possibility for the next season stays open underneath it. Justin closed the cellar door and walked back to the house.
The log was waiting for him on the table, and he had one more entry to write.